Well, good afternoon, everyone. How has your day been thus far? So far, so good? Seems like there's a lot of energy in the room, a lot of learning taking place, a lot of great ideas going back and forth, right? Good, good. Well, it's my pleasure to be able to introduce two people who I've known for quite some time and whose work I respect immensely. But as great as their work is, they're even better people. And they genuinely care about others and they care about this profession. And so it's really truly a pleasure to number one to have them here in the building with us. Lane DeGregory and Maria Carrillo. See, I've been in Arizona for a while, so yes. So Lane DeGregory, of course, as we know, is one of the most foremost journalists of our time. She's a Pulitzer Prize winner, and she loves true stories, intimate details, and big ideas. She interviews strangers and writes about real people, some famous, but mostly folks struggling in the shadows. In 30 years, she has shared more than 3,000 stories in newspapers and magazines. She is a feature writer at the Tampa Bay Times, where she has been since 2000. Lane is also the author of the nonfiction book, The Girl in the Window and Other True Tales. It's a craft guide centered around 24 of her unforgettable stories, including the story that won the Pulitzer Prize for feature writing in 2009. Lane teaches at the Poynter Institute and journalism conferences around the world, and she shares narrative nonfiction writing tips on her podcast, Right Lane. Maria is a consultant and coach after spending 36 years in 7 newsrooms. She was enterprise editor at the Tampa Bay Times and Houston Chronicle, and before that, managing editor at the Virginian Pilot. She has edited dozens of award-winning projects, often lectures on narrative journalism, and co-hosts the podcast Right Lane about the craft. She is a board member of the Virginia Center for Investigative Journalism, visiting faculty at the Poynter Institute, and a juror for the Hillman Prizes. She has been a Pulitzer Prize juror 6 times. I thought I was feeling good because I did it twice, but you've done it 3 times as many times. Carrillo was born in Washington, D.C. 2 years after her parents left Cuba in exile. She now lives in St. Petersburg, Florida. Ladies and gentlemen, Maria and Lane.
Thank you, Batinto. I want to give a round of applause for Batinto because Dean Batts, I'm sorry, he's been Batinto since we were very young together. Dean Batts made this happen. Dean Batts had this idea to do this thing for students. And then Laura and I came to him and said, well, we also have some professionals who would like to do this thing. So he gave us a space. He gave us a lot of the technical support. Thank you, Dean Batts, so much for making this happen for us and for being part of this world for all this time. Okay, and thank you guys for being with us for a couple of days here. I can't believe it's already the end of the day. Maria and I wanted to talk about, hopefully this is not going to be too like preaching to the choir type things, but we want to talk a little bit about the art of narrative and how the pieces that you need for narrative and the reporting process and the structure process is different than for informational stories or for news you can use type stories. So we're going to go through a case study of The Girl in the Window. Hopefully that's not too old to everybody, but talk about the ingredients for that and structure of that and everything too. So thank you. All right.
Okay, by the way, Mike Wilson was supposed to be doing this session, and as we know, he didn't make it. So I'm filling in. I did not edit The Girl in the Window. Mike did. I did edit The Girl in the Window 10 years later. So I'm very familiar with the story. But yes, backing up a little bit, I want to talk about defining narrative because a lot of people throw that word around and sometimes what they're describing is a story that may have some narrative elements, but wouldn't be what I would consider a true narrative. This definition by John Franklin, who is a two-time Pulitzer winner, I think is the best one there is that I've seen. It's basically, you're going to take me on a journey, and at the end of that journey, there's a reason that we went on that journey, right? There's a moral to the story. So chronology with meaning. That doesn't mean that other stories can't benefit from narrative techniques, right? So we've talked a lot about dialogue instead of quotes. We've talked a lot about incorporating scenes into your story. So and character development, right? There are a lot of narrative practices that can improve your story, but true narratives are not everywhere and not easy to get. We're gonna talk a little more here about the elements you need, and sometimes you're not going to have everything you need to make it happen. So you don't force it, because those stories don't work either, right? And narrative, true narratives in journalism. We've had them traditionally. It seems like as an industry, we have waves. It kind of comes in waves sometimes, where we really lean in and then it sort of disappears for a while. We decide that readers have no attention span and they don't want long stories. And then we just figure out, no, wait a minute, they do like long stories. And so we're back to it, right? To me, some of the history is fascinating. If you Google today, Ernest Hemingway and the end of the ambulance run, you'll see a story from the Kansas City Star when he was a reporter there in the early 1900s, right? This is a form that goes back a long way. And it was, of course, back in the day, without the competition of the internet, people had time and energy for it. But you will still see stories like The Girl in the Window that suddenly just get people's attention and carry them forward, right? And we love those kind of narratives. So anyway, that is how I would define it.
We talked about this a little bit earlier briefly, but I wanted to give you, I wanted to give you guys the graphic design. Someone asked me back there, right? So the first part of any process of doing a story is finding the idea, right? How do you get the ideas to come to you? How do you sharpen the ideas? How do you take an issue and turn it into a story, right? So we did this a lot, both Maria and I and Mike and I and our team, where we would put an idea or an issue into the middle of that circle or the middle of the sun or whatever it is, and then brainstorm around it, together as a group, or you and your editor or whatever, when you're sitting there in the morning and you're like, I don't know what I'm doing today. So anything from like abortion, immigration, hurricanes, put the thing in the middle and then find as many, what are there 8 spokes? Find 6, 8 different ways into that idea or that story. Who has something at stake in that story? We did one about food stamps. The most number of new food stamps people were in the country were in Florida. And so we put food stamps in the middle and went around and said, okay, we can have the people giving out the food stamps. We can have the people trying to use the food stamps. We can have people trying to find how to get on food stamps for the first time. We could go to the grocery store with someone trying to navigate the crazy ass world of what you can and cannot buy on food stamps. And so we kind of sharpened that idea going around and around the wheel. And it was a one-day story. And it was a narrative. We found a young mom with a little boy who was trying to get on food stamps, and then we went to the grocery store with her. And that story got a ton of attention. The little boy got a ton of McDonald's coupons because his mom was like, I can't afford McDonald's anymore. It's not on food stamps, buddy. But I think it's a really interesting exercise to do for whatever issue it is that you're writing about, whether it's on the news or just a big like looming thing that your newsroom is talking about. Where do we find ideas from? A lot more. I was talking with someone the other day, like we don't have daily feature section anymore. That whole idea of like, do you guys know the term, hey, Mabel? Like a story that would just run on the front page or on some section. It would be about nothing important, but it would make you go, hey, Mabel, did you see the story about the 3-legged dog? Just something to make people engage. We don't do that as much anymore. And a lot more of my stories, and I suspect yours too, are coming from that's off the news. It's something relevant that people want to find a window in, put a face on, try to figure out a way, how is it affecting our community? So that's usually the first place I look, is off the news or off of issues. But I also think of us for this room of feature telling people, like events, right? Someone just talked about Thanksgiving, right? Holidays always elude us for some reason. Those are really fun places to try, and for young reporters to try a narrative, because everybody needs a Mother's Day story, a Valentine's Day story, whatever it is. And you can punch that button and try a narrative. And it's a lot easier, a lot lower bar than if you're just like, can I have 3 weeks to do this big, giant investigative thing? Off a moment, I think some of my favorite quick turn stories have been really tightly framed. A day in the life, an hour in the life, and those are things to look at too when you're circulating your stakeholders, but also off your life. I don't like first person. I don't feel comfortable doing first person. I kind of don't like the trend where a lot of narrative is now about the person who's writing the narrative. I mean, I know some people will disagree, but I think it is important to look at your own life and see like what things are happening to you, your kids, your friends, your community, and how can that be turned into a narrative? I often find like just stuff people are talking about at bars. Like what are people discussing while they're out in the community? Those are good jumping off points for that. And this is a really fun exercise to do if you're teaching like with students in a classroom of people all throwing their heads at it together. Okay, so we taught a class in Norway, and the people in Norway had never really tried narrative journalism, and they were super interested in what it was and how to do it. And Maria and I kind of came up with this formula, like what do you need for a narrative? And this was helpful with my students too. Like, do you have these elements? Because if you don't, you probably can't do a narrative, right? The first thing, and we'll go in a little bit more in depth on this, but the first thing I really need is a super strong character and a character who will let me in. And maybe it's not even always a person. Maybe it's a house or a park. We did a story about a food pantry, like a little box, like those little free libraries, but it was free food during the pandemic. And we just spent a day at the box watching the people drop stuff off and pick stuff up, and had this really rich story about people not only trying to help each other during the pandemic, but connect with each other because they would like linger at this little pantry and have these community conversations. Action. Is something going to happen? I know Maria can talk about this too, but a lot of the young reporters who come in are like, oh, I have this great scene. And you're like, okay, and what are we looking for? Something has to happen, even if it's just something really small. You're waiting for a letter in the mail, or you're waiting for your kid to call you, or something like something. You have to have readers have something that they want to like hold on for, whether they're following you for 1,000 words or 10,000 words. What's at stake in the action setting? So this is casting around, right, for story ideas. S is setting or scene. And I think that's maybe as after character is the most important thing for me. I think one thing that narratives do that a lot of news stories don't do is transport your readers somewhere. They can take you to a new place. John Pendergraft, our mutual friend, a photographer we worked with, he and I did this project for like 3 years. He had beautiful footage, video, drone footage, everything. He's like, I don't know how to start this story. I don't know where to begin with this documentary we want to make. So he sat up all night one night. He had a 10-year-old little girl who loved Disney movies. And he sat up all night one night and he watched the first 2 minutes of like 60 different Disney movies. And he said like 85% of them start with a sense of place. You got Moana in her island. You got Dumbo in his circus tent. You got the frozen princess girls in their frozen tundra. And so I think that is a really good way to start a story for me, is being able to transport your readers to a place, a scene or a setting that they can immerse themselves in and all of a sudden feel like they're along for the ride, right? They're coming with you to this place. And that a lot of sensory details come in to that too, right? Are you seeing, you're seeing and hearing, right? But are you tasting something? Are you touching something? So those sensory details really help explode a setting. And then the last one on here is something we don't talk about very much. I never talked about this when I was a young reporter till Maria started asking me, what's the theme? I was like, I don't know. But having a one-word universal theme, I think really helps not only you structuring your story, but how are the readers going to enter it, right? Not everybody can experience or cares to experience the specifics of what is happening. But if you can find a universal theme, is this about love? Is it about anger? Is it about revenge? Is it about hope? Maria always makes fun of me because I like hope stories. But finding that one word theme super duper helps me organizing my stories, figuring what to leave in, what to leave out, and also what do I want the readers to take away or to connect with, right?
Let me just add that, I think one of the great things about narrative and why we're so drawn to it is because it helps us get beyond the what, when, where of news coverage to the why and the how. The why and the how are always more intriguing to me. And so it's a way to go there, to find those stories that may not be obvious right away, or that really are more powerful a few weeks or months after a news event, say. But anyway, these are great things to be looking for. And again, I just want to reiterate too, you got to find people who are willing to let you in, right? Because again, if you don't have these elements, you're going to be fighting an uphill battle to try to tell a really good narrative story.
And part of that too, I think Eli mentioned this a little bit this morning, but being honest with people about what you want or need from them. I'm never going to say like, can I embed in your life for 6 months? But I'm going to say, can I come over to your house? Can I meet your dog? Can I be with you when you go run errands? And kind of give them an ask from the beginning. So because I think a lot of times when you go, oh, I'm a reporter, I want to come do a story, they're like, okay, you can call me and I'll give you some quotes. People don't really understand. So I think a lot of the success of narratives sometimes is just seeding that and getting you people on board with you so they know what's expected of them and letting them ask questions of you as well.
So we're going to talk about The Girl in the Window, and some of you may have read this story, of course. Maybe you haven't read it recently, but I told Lane I thought we should read the beginning of the story just to set the mood for you. For those who don't know, this is a story about a feral child. The family had lived in the rundown rental house for almost 3 years when someone first saw a child's face in the window. The little girl, pale, with dark eyes, lifted a dirty blanket above the broken glass and peered out, one neighbor remembered. Everyone knew a woman lived in the house with her boyfriend and 2 adult sons, but they had never seen a child there, had never noticed anyone playing in the overgrown yard. The girl looked young, 5 or 6, and thin, too thin. Her cheeks seemed sunken, her eyes were lost. The child stared into the square of sunlight, then slipped away. Months went by. The face never reappeared. Just before noon on July 13th, 2005, a Plant City police car pulled up outside that shattered window. 2 officers went into the house, and one stumbled back out. Clutching his stomach, the rookie retched in the weeds. Plant City Detective Mark Holste had been on the force for 18 years when he and his young partner were sent to the house on Old Sydney Road to stand by during a child abuse investigation. Someone had finally called the police. They found a car parked outside. The driver's door was open and a woman was slumped over in her seat, sobbing. She was an investigator for the Florida Department of Children and Families. Unbelievable, she told Holste. The worst I've ever seen. The police officers walked through the front door into a cramped living room. I've been in rooms with bodies rotting there for a week, and it never stunk that bad, Holste said later. There's just no way to describe it. Urine and feces, dog, cat, and human excrement smeared on the walls, mashed into the carpet, everything dank and rotting. Tattered curtains, yellow with cigarette smoke, dangling from bent metal rods. Cardboard and old comforters stuffed into broken, grimy windows. Trash blanketing the stained couch, the stinky counters. The floor, walls, even the ceiling seemed to sway beneath legions of scuttling roaches. It sounded like you were walking on eggshells. You couldn't take a step without crunching German cockroaches, the detective said. They were in the lights, in the furniture, even inside the freezer. The freezer! While Holste looked around, a stout woman in a faded housecoat demanded to know what was going on. Yes, she lived there. Yes, those were her 2 sons in the living room. Her daughter? Well, yes, she had a daughter. The detective strode past her, down a narrow hall. He turned the handle on a door, which opened into a space the size of a walk-in closet. He squinted in the dark. At his feet, something stirred.
So I got this story as a tip from a woman who works for the Heart Gallery. You guys probably all have heart galleries in your communities. So here's my tip. There's great stories there, but you have to train the PR people about what you want. because every year she would say, I've got 372 children who need to be adopted. Heart Gallery are the kids whose parental rights have been terminated, but they haven't been adopted, right? So they're available to be adopted. It's almost like pet of the week, pick this cute little face and fall in love with it. So every year she would tell me, I've got these pictures that are going up in a mall or a video arcade or a church or somewhere, and come write a little story. And I was like, all right, that's a brief, that's like a B city brief. They're going to put the new faces of all these poor little kids up at the mall this weekend. But I told her, like, for 2 or 3 years in a row, if you can find me a specific child or a specific set of parents who are looking to adopt a child, and I can follow them and tell their story, it's going to be so much more powerful to really tell one story in depth than to say there's 370 kids in Pinellas County who need a family, right? So I wasn't sure she was listening to me or heard me, but on a Super Bowl Sunday, she called me, and in 2008, she called me and she said, oh my God, Lane, I've been to the Heart Gallery for 30 years. We have this little girl who's here now. She's a feral child. And I was like, I don't know what that is exactly. All I could think of was like Mowgli from the Jungle Book, And she said, no, that this little girl's been neglected almost to death. So that was the entry point to this story. And I had Danny, her name is Danny Lero, this little girl. She was the same age as my son at the time, 7. And my son is a loquacious, talkative little kid who I had to always be like, shut the hell up, Tucker. Children should be seen and not heard, Tucker, But I really thought going into this story that I would be able to talk to Danny, right? That my main character would be this little girl, and I could have a conversation with her about what had happened to her and what she was like, life was like for her now. And we got there and we realized that she was completely nonverbal. And not only that, she didn't know that we were there even necessarily. She almost presented as like a really severely autistic, which was awful because I couldn't interview her, but it was great because the photographer could take whatever pictures she wanted and capture this little girl who didn't pay any attention to us whatsoever. But I tell you that to say, I thought the main character was going to be Danny, and I quickly had to pivot and do the stakeholder thing around there and say, who else are my characters? Is the cop a character? Is the psychologist a character? Is the doctor a character? And then by the time we got kind of into the story, a family had come forward to adopt her. So the parents became much more of the character than Danny at that part. But when I'm casting around for characters, those are the things I kind of look for. Like, do you want to write about an everyman who is like all the other people? We had a class yesterday morning with the girl who wanted to write about a cricket team here at Arizona State. And she wanted to write about the team. And I said, all right, do you want to write about, someone who's played cricket all their lives and they're coming here now and want to find this community? Or do you want to write about someone who's never played cricket, didn't know what it was, and just wanted to join this team? Or do you write about the coach who's organizing this thing? So what kind of guide or what kind of character do you want to lead your readers along? And then I think the second bullet point on there's the most important thing. Are they going to give you access? Are they going to give you insight? Is there some introspection? Sometimes you get a character and they're totally willing to let you in, but they haven't thought about anything. They're like 1 inch deep and they're like, okay, I'll answer your question. But if they can't think about something or process something with you, that they're not really as rich of a character. And maybe you go look for somebody else on that wheel. What do they want? That's the most important thing I usually want to ask somebody. What's at stake for you, right? And even if it's only like a little daily story or a weekly story, what's going to happen next in your life? What are you worried about? What are you excited about? What are you hoping for? And a lot of times that informs my reporting about like, when do I need to show up, right? When are they going to be doing something that's important or waiting for something to happen? And then I can tailor my time with them around that day. I have a list of 30 questions that I ask anybody, whatever. I can share with you guys later if you want. But my favorite one on there is, what do you regret? Because I think, Mike Wilson likes to talk about the bruise on the apple. If you guys have heard that term, like the more perfect your person is that you're writing about, the more important it is to find something not wrong with them, but at least to like humanize them, something to put a dent in their halo or whatever. Because I like to write about do-gooders. But a lot of times no one's going to tell you that about themselves, right? Like, here's the bad part about me, or I was a shitty mom, or whatever it is. But if you ask them what they regret, that gives people a chance to offer that up themselves a little bit and to, I don't know, process it in a way that they can shape it, but it also shows you a vulnerability, or something that they had done wrong. And then the fifth part on here, I'm sure you guys know this, but seek internal dialogue with your characters. It's not enough just to ask them what they were doing or what they saw. What were you thinking? What were you feeling? I love the question, were you praying about anything? What were you worrying about? What were you saying in your head? Do you have a mantra before you go do something that you rehearse in your head? I just did a little story about a big story about sea turtles in Florida. All these sea turtles died this year because of the cold snap. And the vet who was saving them said she's always giving them this little speech before she sends them back to the water, like, be a good boy, don't get eaten by a shark, go make lots of babies, you know? And so to have this dialogue in her head talking to the turtle was really, really cool. Okay, action, we talked about that a little bit, but is somebody on a quest? Is there a complication of something that's going on? What is the question you're trying to ask? I really don't like nut graphs at all, at all, at all. But if I can find a question to propel the readers to the next section, that is a really great nut graph to me. Like, make them engaged so they can't stop reading, even though you have to give them some background now or some context now or put some broccoli afterwards.
But I do think narratives make a promise, right? You think about it as a promise. You make a promise of what you're going to get if you stick with this story. So it's not a traditional nut graph per se, but it's the challenge that rises up to you to kind of hang with it, right? In the case of Danny, the question is, can this couple who adopted her make up for all those years of abuse? How far can that go in turning the course of her life? Right.
Can love save her? Man, they really did think, and it wasn't for them. It wasn't like medical, like psychological. It was like, can our love save her? Yeah. Okay, we talked about setting a bit, transport the readers, give them a sense of place. I think it's interesting to think, especially when you're starting a story, if you want to start in a place, do you give them the drone's era view, like you're up above of a community? Like, I think about the beginning of Edward Scissorhands, and they kind of fly into this community. You're like, every single house is exactly the same, and you know where you are, and you know if this suburban tale is going to be set in this place that you can recognize off your own life, right? Or do you start with this like really tiny zooming in up close? Like, I don't know if you guys have seen the movie Blue Velvet, David Lynch movie. And do you remember how it starts? There's an ear in the grass on the side of the road, and they zoom in from the side of the road to the ear, and then there's like all these ants eating the human ear, right? How can you not watch that? But it starts so tightly focused in on these ants, this tiny small part, and then it zooms out. So I think about camera angles when I'm talking about setting a lot.
Talk a little bit about why you started Danny, where you started Danny's story at that house, that gross house.
Yeah, I mean, we debated about where to start that story. And for all of you guys who like to recreate things, that whole beginning of that story was recreated. I wasn't there for any of that. But I think we decided to start there because that was where the world first was aware of Danny, right? Until that point in time, she was cloistered away. And we were able to get the cop report. We were able to get the Florida Department of Children and Families report. I was able to get the court records, all these things that helped short. And the police officer was amazing. He had 87 pictures from the scene, 87 evidence photos that he just clicked through on his computer and narrated for me. That's when he's talking about the cockroaches in the freezer and the smell and the tattered curtains with the yellow cigarette smoke. He was amazing. So he was completely able to transport me back to that day. And he cried talking about her. I mean, this big, handsome cop cried. It was just an amazing moment. But yeah, and then so that beginning then kind of turned on the question of, can their love and caring make up for a lifetime of neglect? But then also history, context. I went down a ginormo rabbit hole in the history of feral children. Do you guys know who her first feral children were? Romulus and Remus, who they named Rome for, were raised by wolves, allegedly, according to the feral child historians. But there are all these amazing stories of other feral children over the ages. And the last one I could find that had been in any kind of the news was from like 1978, a little girl named Jeannie who'd been strapped to a potty chair in California until she was 13 years old. And PBS had done this giant documentary on her in the 70s. And I was able to get that and get the transcript of that and check up on that too. So a lot of times I think it's up to my editors to rein me in because I love going down those history contexts, what else is out there things, and that section probably got cut in half. But it's really important to inform you about like how rare is this thing and what's happened to other kids, in that same situation. And then we talked about 5 senses. So I write on the top of my notepad, I write hear, see, touch, smell, taste. And I want to check off that box. I make myself remember when I'm out in the field to check off all those boxes for the 5 senses.
as gross as that was in that beginning, right? You can hear what he's hearing and what he's smelling, and the fact that he's having trouble seeing the girl in the closet. All of that, right? It all comes too vividly to life, I think. All right, and then theme, of course, so we're just talking about this. This is a story about love. As awful as it is, it's about love because it's the love she was denied, and then the love that is trying to save her, right? And when you know that, then that helps Lane shape what's going to go in this story and what doesn't need to go in this story. For instance, all of the background on feral children, right? You need a little bit of that, but not a lot of that. So again, this is so important. I mean, and if you have a narrative story, you have to have that universal idea. I don't know if you guys keyed on the start of the second section of Mark Warren's story, where he talked that all of us have a secret we keep, right? It was so interesting the way it was structured because he made it universal, right? Almost from the get-go, right? You may not be cross-dressing and doing all the things that this pastor was doing, of course, but whatever secret that you're keeping, suddenly it becomes a very human thing, right? And this story that you may have no connection to is something that you start feeling a connection to. I don't have a connection to feral children, of course, but I remember reading this story. I read this story out loud to my family when we were going to Niagara Falls on a vacation, right? I said, oh God, you won't believe the story Lane has done. And so I read this story to them, and it was so powerful for all of us to think about children. They were young. My kids were young at the time. Think about children being abused. But for my husband and I, it was like, what kind of parent does that? Who does that? Right? And how lucky we were to, have had not had obviously a horrible situation like that. But if you're struggling with the theme, talk it out. Talk to somebody that you've pitching the story to, and help yourself to that word, because it's really gonna help you a ton to try to pull that story together.
I think it's good to keep thinking about it too. Like, so when I hear a song now or I watch a Netflix, I'm like, what's the theme? It's good to practice that way and just say, what can you pull away from it? And a lot of times me and my husband don't agree. We don't always agree, but talking that through is a very rich experience. It helps you really figure out what is the story we're trying to tell and why.
Whoops. Ooh, wait, I skipped what editors need. Wait, I need to tell you what editors need. Okay. So, all these things that we've been talking about are things that I'm looking for, obviously, when someone's making a pitch. I try to tell people that, a lot of times people come at you with an idea that's not really fully formed, or it's really, really broad. Sometimes it's a noun and not a verb, right? I have an interest in this subject, but it really doesn't have an idea that's fully formed. So I'm always pursuing that and asking that question. And another thing that I think is really important that we haven't really mentioned right here is tension. Is there some tension? Lane talked about action, of course, and being able to see things, but I want some level of tension in a story. Imagine The Sound of Music without the Nazis. Okay. Right. It's still great songs, and a lot. It's Julie Andrews. It's Maria. But the Nazis bring it to a whole other level, right? So, and this is one thing that we talk about. So when Lane would come with an idea, and Lane has 8 gazillion ideas every day, all the time, and I remember one when in our time at the Times where she was like, "Oh, there's this special education teacher, and he's retiring, and everybody is they love him, and I want to go to this event." And I said, there's no tension in that story, right? None at all, no tension. And she's like, oh, it's just a day. I'll go, because she loves human interest stories, right? And so she goes to this party, and she calls me and she goes, God, that was boring. And I said, yeah, but she still had to pull something out there because she committed to it. But it was like, is there tension? and it doesn't have to be like tension with a capital T, but is there something is some question that we're going to answer or some question that we're going to be pondering as we walk away from that story, right? So those are the things that I'm trying to get out of people. And yes, that level of communication, if you can. If you don't have an editor that works with you that way, find a buddy, find a buddy in this room, find somebody that you can talk to and say, hey, I've got this idea and here's what I'm thinking. Because they will invariably help you to get to a better place in terms of the pitch and what you're trying to do.
Oh, well, there was one other thing on the bottom of that, but you don't have to go back. But
Right.
the last thing on there was, talks before, during, after reporting. Editors, reporters, you guys, this is so important. I was talking to someone, can't remember, you this morning, right? About you take stories from writers that you've never talked to or had a conversation with, right? And that's not okay. Like if you're the reporter, you need to make your editor have that conversation with you. We would talk not only like when I got the idea, but then when I'd come back from reporting, that was the really important part, to have this conversation after reporting and before you start writing. Make your editor talk to you, make your reporters talk to you. I would chase down Mike Wilson, who had to leave early to get his kid at a little league game, and our parking lot was like 2 blocks away at the time. So I'd be like, okay, I just want to talk to you about my story. And we just like run across, like he was walking to his car. I was telling him about my story. I didn't want to start writing without him. I don't want to start writing without you. And it's so much easier when you have the same roadmap. I would never really start writing a story till I knew where it was going to begin and where it was going to end and what the theme was.
I'm just reminded of one of the stories. Lane and I had such a great time early in our career when we first got together because we could do anything. We were in this narrative team and we could write whatever we wanted to. And she comes up and she's found a guy who is starting a pickup poop business, a dog business. And basically this guy is kind of aimless and has really struggled to find a career. And his wife sort of gave him an ultimatum, like, okay, you can try this, but only for a period of time. And there was actually great tension in this story because, Lane did this lead where she followed him around, and the kicker of the lead was, this guy's picking up the poop and she says, the stuff that dreams are made of. But the tension is, how long is this guy really going to be able to keep this up as a career choice, right? So again, doesn't have to be tension with a capital T, but something that's really going to propel the story, right? Do you remember the poop man?
Oh yeah, and that guy, he could tell a Rottweiler poop from a Doberman poop. That's how what an expert he was, right?
And think about that for a second here. It's what is it now? 26 years later, and I can still remember the kicker to that story. That to me is the gift of narrative. It has this way of staying with you, right? Lingering.
That was a really short story too, like a 1 day, 1,000 word something. The other thing about the poop guy that you reminded me of, I think a lot of times people want to write about the people who are super successful, the people who make it on the team, the people who become the CEO, the people who, I don't know, have their novel published or whatever. Losers make better stories. People whose dreams don't come true, people who have to fight through what they thought they were going to be and then refigure it out, people who have to go to their wife, I guess this poop job isn't working, honey. I'm going to work at Walmart. Like when their dreams don't come true, that's a more rich place to start mining, I think, a lot of times than the people who.
Even people who are assholes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
You do this? Okay. This is probably obvious to you guys, but I just want to break down this process a little bit. I don't like to do outlines. Maria likes to do
Force
outlines.
her.
But I really am a fan of timelines. And sometimes I make 3, 4 timelines for each story because it's super helpful to see where the timelines start to braid. So in this story, I had a timeline of Danny's life. I had a timeline of her parents, adoptive parents' life. I had a timeline of the Heart Gallery. I had a timeline of feral children. And I had a timeline of like psychiatric help for kids who had no socialization when they were little. And each of those timelines, when you start putting them together, you see, oh, this intersects here or this intersects there. And that's some great moments of tension, right? So that's super helpful to me to go as like detailed as I can and as far back as I can. My turtle story started with the dinosaurs because sea turtles have been around 150 million years. So that timeline started 150 BC or whatever. But it's like just figuring out the history of all the different components of your story is super helpful. I make a list of the scenes I have, both the ones that I've witnessed and the ones I can or want to recreate. So I know how many scenes, like which scenes I want to pick out. We covered this, Florida had my county in Florida had the only all-female drug court during the opioid epidemic. And we spent a year in drug court, John and I actually, following women trying to get their jobs back, to get their kids back, to get their driver's license back. Well, we had like 50 Tuesdays in drug court. And my editor was like, let's pick 3. Because, you know, they all start feeling exactly the same. So when you make a list of your scenes, you can see what pop out the most or what gets kind of repetitive. List of characters, secondary characters, who's missing. Sometimes you can fill in those holes. And then this was a gift from my very first editor who would say, Lane, your story is not in your notebook. Your story is in your head and in your heart. And he would have me come back from reporting, whether it was a daily or a weekender. I wasn't doing very long stuff with him, but he would go like, give me your notes. And I would be terrified. Like he could see I can't spell. Well, I have terrible handwriting. He's going to see. He didn't ever look at them. He wanted me to tell him the story without looking at my notes. And that has been the biggest gift, I swear, of growing me from a reporter to a writer, is learning to write without my notes. Because then I'm me. I'm not the 27 people I've interviewed. I'm not beholden to their chronology. I'm not beholden to their quotes, you know? And you guys all know it is so much easier to just spend like 2 hours flipping through your notebook and find the good quotes and be like, okay, now I'm good. It's not helpful. Stashed. I take notes on my notes. So if I have like, I think the girl in the window had 8 legal pads of notes, and I reduce each legal pad to 1 page of notes. So then I have 8 pages of notes instead of 8 legal pads, but it also helps me like remind myself what's important within those notes, familiarize myself with the material again. I spent 6 months on this story. Find the good quotes that I'm going to use so I don't have to keep flipping around for them. But then after I've gone through my notes and taken my notes on my notes, I stick them in my kitchen. I stick them in my car. I stick them somewhere not where I'm at. And I tell the story out loud, often to my dogs or someone who's going to listen. And then by the time I sit down to write, I don't have to look at a blank screen. I don't have to think, I'm like, I've got writer's block. Like, I know what the story is. And I'm telling you, it is so much easier to tell a story without your notes. Because you guys, what is our slogan? We're the storytellers, right? Yeah, opening and ending. We talked about that, always kind of knowing where you're starting and ending. Go in a cave if you can. When I'm really writing, when I'm in writing mode, I got to close all my other windows. I got to turn off my phone. I got to make sure that the dogs are not barking at the UPS man. Like, go in a cave and give yourself that time. Just you and your story, just to sit there, you know. One of my colleagues used to always have her Twitter open and her LinkedIn open, and she's like, I can't concentrate. And I'm like, well, no, duh. Like, give yourself some blank space, right? And then I like to write to a reward. I like to make myself sit down and butt in the chair until I finish a Diet Coke. And then like, okay, and get up, change the laundry, do the dishes, whatever, give myself a break, but make yourself sit there for a period of time so that you can actually just concentrate on nothing but the writing.
Let me just underscore too here that I think one of the things, whether you're an editor or you're a writer, you know, when Lane is telling a story, it's Lane's story, right? So she's telling the story of Danny. So you think, well, it's Danny's story. Well, no, it's actually all of the stuff that has come through Lane's lens and how she's determined that she's going to tell the story. And I think that's an evolution for writers and a way for your editor to help you too, is to say, have the courage to tell the story that you've collected, right? That you want to tell. And I'm not saying don't test out your theory. If you think there's a certain theme to this story, or this is the approach you want to take, certainly you can go to your subject and say, this is what I'm thinking. This is what feels like the theme of what this story would be, and see if they say, oh gosh, I don't understand that. A lot of times they haven't been thinking about that, right? But just that if you're going to be a narrative writer, you have to accept that it's your take, and it's the way that you're seeing and what is compelling to you.
Yeah, because several people after the story came out, part of the backdrop of is the children investigators have been to this house twice before, and they never took this little girl away. So some of the readers were like, why didn't you write an indictment of the DCF? Why didn't you write about how they let this happen? That wasn't my story I set out to tell. people got that. You got that from reading the story. You got outraged and incensed that like, why didn't they do anything? But that wasn't the story I set out to tell. So
Okay, so we've talked already about, finding somebody to help you if you don't have somebody at your shop. And of course, I already beat you over the head about jargon. Cliches too. Elaine and I used to work with a movie critic, and Jim and Robert, his name was Mal Vincent, and he had this Southern drawl, and he would say to me, "Ritas love cliches." And I said, "No, they don't. No. They're comfortable, but often they're just, what are you really trying to say, right?" But anyway, so this process to me, if you're doing narrative work, you're already on the same page with the writer. You already have a sense of what the story is going to do, where you're going to start, where you're going to end. So when you're getting to the editing process, what you're really doing is polishing the story, right? You're trying to get the most out of it and really make it as impactful as you can. The lose the last line is an interesting thing because it's sort of this idea that where is your ending really, right? Because sometimes you probably all had this experience. You thought you did a great ending, then you read it again. You thought, oh, what if I ended a paragraph before that or the paragraph before that, right? And see what happens there. Of course, read aloud. We've talked about another thing. Steve Padilla, who is terrific from the Los Angeles Times, his little trick that he has is when they get all done with editing a story, he'll say, "Now go take 30 more words out of it," and force writers to go back and make it even stronger, right? Push it even more. Okay, we're back to the end.
I think we're back to the ending. Do you
Let's
have questions or
let's get a
things
little
that you're
time for
working through
questions.
yourselves that you want to talk about?
Yeah, microphone is up.
Hi, I was wondering if you could weigh in on how you think about issues of consent with certain subjects. Like in Girl in the Window, this is not only a minor small child, but they're nonverbal. Their parents aren't looking out for them. They've been failed by the system. So who can consent on their behalf, really? And how do you think through that as a journalist? I've come up with similar situations with like unaccompanied minors who have come into the country. English isn't their first language. They're kind of in a similar situation of, they don't have adults that you would normally go to get the sign off to do a story like that.
In this case, I had the adoptive parents who at that point had charge of her, like legally. So getting their buy-in was the big hurdle for me. The foster care system and the Heart Gallery had given me carte blanche to tell her backstory, but I needed her parents now to consent to me to let me tell her story at this point in time. And we talked a little bit yesterday with some students about like the importance of having a pickup line. Like when you're going to talk to somebody about, please let me write your story. Why? Why should you let me write your story? What's in it for me, right? You're going to ask me to come into my house, to come to church with me, to go to the beach with me. Why should I let you do this? And for this family, my pitch was, well, you guys adopted this super duper damaged child out of love. They were very religious. They thought God had handed them this child in a dream. And I said, well, if you guys can adopt this really damaged child who needs so much care and attention, think of what you could do to help other kids in the foster care system get adopted. And they went and prayed about it. And then they came back and they said, you're right. We want to help. We want to let other kids out there get a chance like this. So yeah, the whole consent thing is really tricky. I did a story about a recovery high school for teenagers this year in Tampa. They were all recovering from drug addict overdoses. Most of them had almost died. And we went back and forth, but for the first time in 33 years, we decided not to use their last names. So we told their stories, they shared their stories, but they're 16, 17 years old and they've almost died of heroin 2-3 times. Like, I don't want them to be 30 years old trying to get a job and have that Googled. You know what I mean? So we went up to the top editor, which I've never done, and said, can we withhold their last names? And they said, yeah.
Yeah, the only thing I'd follow up, and I do think these are things that you should wrestle with, and the more that if the subject of your story, you're not even sure that they're consenting willingly, or do they want to be a part of this? What can you do to minimize the damage? I think minimizing harm should be one of our. I mean, that's one of my ethical go-tos. So if you feel like the story is compelling enough, but you're worried that it's going to do some damage, is there anything you can do to minimize that?
And add a little detail on that too, because a lot of the details we got were really, really salacious in that story. And the parents were super worried about us making her seem animalistic. That was their word. They don't want her to seem like an animal. So we were trying to be very respectful of that. And there was this one crazy scene after church one day where the mom is trying to make lunch and the dad is outside with the dog and the little brother is, I don't even know where. And Danny like gets in her diaper and smears poop all over the TV, the floor, the walls. She just like willy-nilly smearing poop everywhere. The photographer took great pictures. I took amazing notes. There was great sensory details in there. And I got to write that part in the story. And Mike, my editor, said, do you have another story? And first he said, what do you think this scene is trying to convey? And I said that she's still not potty trained and she's 9 years old. And she's so, like, this is what the parents are having to deal with on a daily basis. And he was like, do you have another scene that shows that? And I said, well, I have this scene where the dad is with her on a baby potty and he's feeding her M&Ms to trying to get her to poop in the potty. He goes, yes, we're not doing the poop smearing on the wall. We're going to do the dad and the M&Ms on the potty. So we swapped that out, trying to be respectful, trying to make her not be animalistic to their photos. Would probably win 1 million awards. It was a crazy scene, but we decided to leave that part out.
That's interesting. I've got kind of a two-part question. And the first part of the question is I'm just going to start with, like, I wish that everyone was reading Lane DeGregory stories, like not just us, but you know, the whole world. I feel like people could learn and benefit a lot from that. One thing that's so interesting about your beat is that you always have a different topic. You know, the girl in the window is so different from the poop guy, which is so different from the police academy and everything like that. But there is this through line of sort of this human experience kind of in all these different topics. And then sort of bringing this to that question of like, how do you, like what we're finding, or in my department where we're sort of generalist features writers, it's like, you know, we have readers coming to us that are foodies, that they go to the food section and they know how to find those stories. They love, you know, Minnesota Vikings and, you know, they go for those. But like no one woke up in the morning and was like, you know, I want to read about this guy that started the poop picking up business. You know, these stories that no one was looking for, but once they read them, they were glad to have read them. And so one thing I like about The Great Read in New York Times is it collects all those things of different topics, but they have the same through line of being like a human interest story. And I'm wondering if you've had ways to help people find your stories is kind of the first part mechanically, like on the website, or do you have like a Lane DeGregory newsletter that, or an alert, you know, that you can get a ping every time you have a news story? And then the second question is sort of, what do you know about your audience? Like the people that like to read your stories, they're like, what are they getting? You know, it's like people that are foodies like to eat out. That's why they're reading your stories. But what do people like about a Lane DeGregory story? And do they have other similarities, like they like to read novels, or they like to, you know what I mean, that would help you find, they hang out on these Facebook groups so you could find them. Sorry, that was maybe the longest question of this entire conference. Thank you.
Here's my short answer. I wish I knew. Like, I have a kind of a short attention span in terms of like, I don't really want to beat anymore. I don't want to spend all my time on the same thing anymore. So I try to broaden, you know, what other subjects matter are. I think maybe the through line is people who like to like to read stories, people who like to share stories, people who like to read something in the paper that they can talk to their neighbor about that's not the news. You know what I mean? Bless you. I think I have a website, but I don't have like a Substack or a newsletter or anything like that. But a lot of the stories come from someone says, oh, you should read the story. You know, I feel a lot of them are the ones that are just like, someone reads it and says to somebody else, you should read this. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of organic. You know, I've been trying to get them to put like a little drop down thing on the Times thing that says narrative reads or good reads or storytelling, you know, but we haven't done that.
There's an enterprise section though still, isn't there? Like there's an investigative section. Yeah. So you can, there's where some of the sort of good reads are collected, but yeah, I think in Lane's case, I mean, one of the one of the great things about living in Tampa Bay is that she has collected all of these people who are fans. So when they see her byline, it doesn't matter what the story is, they're diving in, and it's, some of that is anecdotal. You get these notes from them, but I think Lane's right. It becomes more word of mouth. So more like, yeah, did you see what was in the paper today? Kind of passing it around.
Hi everyone, my name is Zainab Haddaji. I'm a journalist from Djibouti. I'm also a tale writer and a poet, and sometimes the writing style got confused in my head, especially when I'm trying to write a feature. So my question is, when doesn't happen to you like you did a story in a feature about a human story in a feature, but you think a feature is not enough to tell the story? What do you do? Like you will go further and write a book or a story, because sometimes I feel kind of frustrated because I'm not able to tell what I want to tell about this character or persona in just a feature on a quick news style.
So when I started out writing the story, I got the tip on Super Bowl Sunday. I pitched it for Easter. So I thought I'd be spending 2 or 3 months on it. I was like, this would be a great rebirth Easter story, right? And after about 3 weeks of reporting, I asked my editor, I said, I need more time. We need more space. There's a lot more to this, And he said, get out of the feral child rabbit hole and let's talk about what we need here. How long are we going to follow this? What are we looking for? What's at stake? Are we waiting for Danny to learn how to talk? Are we waiting for Danny to get enrolled in school? Are we waiting for the parents to take her to therapy? And trying to figure out like how long to pursue it. But to your point, the other thing that we did in this story, this was 2008, this came out. We had never had a video on the Tampa Bay Times website before. And at a certain point, we had this, roundtable meeting about what do you got? Okay, great story, fun pictures, good history, whatever. And some guy I didn't even really know in the newsroom was like, what do you do for the web? I was like, what? No one had ever asked that before in 2008. I'd not ever thought about what that would be. So at the last minute, we went back and the photographer took a video camera and we made like an 8-minute video of Danny. And it's really bad. If you look at it, it's still online, but it's like if you want to go to the Wayback Machine and see how the Tampa Bay Times first did videos, it's like a slideshow with at one point it switches from black and white to color and it's very wacky. But I was kind of mad and worried about that. I was like, well, if there's an 8-minute video, why would they read my 5,000 word story? You know what I mean? And then when I watched the video, there's a scene in it where Danny has this meltdown during speech therapy. And she's like just really running around in circles and shrieking and like banging her head. And I was like, I can't write that. There's no way I could write that better than what that is for people to see, So it ended up really being another layer of the storytelling that we'd never had before. And I was grateful for that,
I'm sure readers still think about her and wonder where she is now and how she's doing. And do you personally find a way to disengage, or do you think maybe I'll circle back when she's an adult and fully functioning? And then how is she going to feel when these sort of very intimate personal experiences are sort of now captured and recorded in the archive?
So the first part of the question, I went back after 3 years and did a follow-up story. There's a reason for that, but I'll go in there. And then when Maria came to be my editor again, it's like a touchstone with my son. So when my son turned 18 and was graduating high school, I was like, Danny's 18. She's aging out of foster care. So I went back at that time and did a 10-year later story. The family was not on social media. The guy didn't even have a cell phone. So it was really hard to keep up with him. Like you had to catch him when he was home on the landline, But I kept up with them on her birthday. I usually reach out, and Christmas time sometimes. I think to your second part of the question, she wouldn't know. She has no idea what's out on the internet or what her name is or yeah. So she's not
She was
accessing or
not able to
tapping into that.
overcome it. I mean, she's in a group home now, and she is still, like, it's interesting because we talked, Lane was going to go up there. It's like, she's still not a willing participant in the story. She doesn't understand what's going on. You know, Lane was able to observe her and, you know, she can find joy and she can express some emotion on things that are happening in her life, but she wouldn't be able to have, she doesn't have the concept of that's a reporter and my name's on the internet. And, you know, and I think that there's no hope for that ever. This is the best it's going to be. But she's physically healthy and she's beloved at her group home. And her dad and her mom divorced, but the dad is still in her life and he goes to see her. And I don't know, it's as
And her-
happy an ending as it could be, I guess.
The ending is on the second, when the 10-year later is like, it's her birthday. It's her 18th birthday we went there for. And she gets a little like Fisher Price toy that makes noise. And she laughed. She had this like ginormo belly laugh, like giggling, almost falling off the couch. And it was like, there's joy here, you know, because the other emotions we saw in the first story and in the 3 years later, it was just frustration and temper tantrums and falling out because she was so unable to communicate, you know. So even just seeing like that little bit of joy when she was laughing at this little airplane was kind of fulfilling, like something had happened that made it better.
If you haven't read the story, I think you can find it online, The Girl in the Window, 10 years later.
And there's a better video with that one, like a real video. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, guys.